still
No,
seems like...
I got him to produce the
Okay, well,
Eagles.
let's hear
They
it.
were produced by, this is before I was in the band, but they were produced by Glyn Johns.
Joe Walsh, legendary guitarist of the Eagles and one of the most outspoken figures in classic rock, finally broke his silence on a subject he has avoided for decades. At 77 years old, Joe has reached a point in his life where he no longer filters his words, no longer worries about industry politics, and no longer feels pressured to protect long-kept secrets. So when he sat down for a recent interview and was asked about Don Henley, he didn't laugh it off. He didn't change the subject, and he certainly didn't offer a vague, diplomatic answer. Instead, he leaned forward, took a deep breath, and revealed the truth he has been carrying for years. One that shocked even lifelong fans of the band for decades. The Eagles were known not only for their legendary music, but for the intense tensions behind the scenes. Joe Walsh and Don Henley, two icons with completely different personalities, often found themselves at the center of rumors, whispered disagreements, creative clashes, and stories that never made it into public interviews. But until now, Joe always brushed off questions about Don with a polite smile or a carefully chosen sentence. This time, however, there was no hesitation. His tone was serious, his expression hardened, and what he finally confirmed about their relationship, their past conflicts, and the truth about Don Henley's behavior left fans absolutely speechless. Joe Walsh's revelation wasn't an angry rant, it was honest, emotional, and surprisingly raw. And as soon as the interview ended, social media exploded. Everyone wanted to know, what did Don Henley really do? Why did Joe stay silent for so long? And what finally pushed him to reveal everything at 77? The truth is far more intense than anyone expected. When Joe Walsh finally decided to speak openly about Don Henley, it wasn't out of anger, bitterness, or a desire to stir up old drama. It came from a place of reflection, something that only age, experience, and decades of living inside the turbulence of the music world can bring. Sitting across from the interviewer, Joe explained that for most of his career, he felt obligated to keep certain parts of the Eagles' history quiet. The band's legacy was too important, the music too iconic, and the internal conflicts too complicated to simplify. But now, at 77, he felt the weight of honesty more than the pressure of silence. It was time, he said, to finally confirm what so many fans had suspected for years. His relationship with Don Henley was far more intense, difficult, and emotionally charged than the public ever knew, according to Joe. Don Henley was the driving force behind the Eagles in more ways than people realize. While Glenn Frey was often seen as the band's leader, Don was the enforcer, the one who demanded perfection, who pushed the band to their limits, and who refused to settle for anything less than excellence. Joe admitted that he respected Don for that, but he also revealed that Don's intensity often created an environment filled with pressure. For someone as free-spirited and chaotic as Joe, that pressure wasn't always easy to handle. He described moments in the studio where Don's standards were so unforgiving that small mistakes or missed notes could lead to heated arguments. Joe said there were nights where he walked out of recording sessions feeling defeated, wondering if he even belonged in a band run with such strict discipline. But despite the tension, Joe clarified something important. Don Henley's demanding nature wasn't rooted in ego, but in a deep desire to make the greatest music possible. Joe explained that Don never approached the Eagles as just another rock band. To him, it was a mission and artistic responsibility. Don believed the band had the potential to set a new standard in rock history, and he wasn't willing to let anything compromise that. Joe admitted that he didn't always understand Don's mindset back then. He was younger, battling addictions, trying to find balance in a chaotic life. But now, looking back with more clarity, Joe said he finally recognizes why Don acted the way he did. Joe also confirmed long-standing rumors about the creative clashes behind the scenes. He said there were times when Don Henley would push for ideas that Joe disagreed with, leading to arguments that sometimes lasted for hours. Don was methodical, structured, and creatively uncompromising. Joe, on the other hand, approached music with instinct, raw emotion, and spontaneity. Their differences created a spark that could either produce brilliance or explode into conflict. Joe admitted that some of their biggest hits were born out of these intense disagreements, but so were some of the deepest rifts between them. One of the most surprising revelations Joe shared was how personal some of the conflicts became. He said Don's frustration with him wasn't always about the music, it was often about his lifestyle. Joe openly admitted that during the band's most successful years, he was far from stable. His addictions, last-minute disappearances, and reckless behavior put extra pressure on the band, and Don was often the one who tried to hold things together. Joe said that Don's stern, sometimes harsh behavior wasn't just about control, it was about trying to protect the band from falling apart. By the end of his explanation, it became clear that Joe's truth about Don Henley wasn't meant to expose or attack him. It was meant to clarify the complicated reality of a partnership that was equal parts admiration and conflict. Joe said that the world sees Don Henley as a perfectionist, and that is true, but what the world never understood was the emotional struggle behind that perfection. Their relationship was difficult, but it was also essential to the Eagles' legacy. After breaking down the emotional and creative conflicts he experienced with Don Henley, Joe Walsh continued explaining why their relationship was far more complicated than the media ever understood. Joe said that while the public often imagined the Eagles as a group of rock stars enjoying fame, wealth, and endless applause, the truth behind the scenes was far more intense. According to him, Don carried a massive amount of responsibility on his shoulders, far more than anyone realized. He wasn't just a drummer or a co-lead singer. He was the protector of the band's image, the manager of its musical direction, and the one who constantly worried about long-term survival. Joe said that looking back now, he sees how much pressure Don was under, and how that pressure affected everyone around him. Joe revealed that one of the biggest sources of tension between them was the difference in how they approached success. Joe admitted that during the band's peak years, he was living like a typical rock guitarist: late nights, unpredictable habits, and a lifestyle that often collided with Don's disciplined, serious approach. Don, Joe said, was laser-focused on maintaining the band's professionalism. He believed that every performance mattered, every recording mattered, and every decision had the potential to either strengthen or damage their legacy. Joe now understands that this wasn't about ego. It was about Don feeling responsible for something bigger than himself. But at the time, Joe felt suffocated, constantly worried that his mistakes, musical or personal, would trigger yet another confrontation. One of the most powerful truths Joe confirmed was the emotional distance that developed between them. He said there were long stretches of time when he and Don barely spoke outside of music-related conversations. Their interactions were strictly professional, almost cold. Joe explained that Don wasn't the kind of person who opened up easily. He carried his emotions privately, rarely letting anyone see his vulnerabilities. Joe, on the other hand, was loud, expressive, and chaotic. Their personalities simply didn't blend naturally, and the more successful the band became, the more those differences were magnified. Joe admitted that he often misinterpreted Don's seriousness as anger or dislike when, in reality, Don simply didn't know how to express himself any other way. But despite the emotional walls, Joe highlighted moments where Don showed a side to him that few people ever witnessed. He remembered times when Don quietly stepped in to help him during his darkest battles with addiction. According to Joe, Don wasn't the type to offer emotional speeches or put an arm around someone, but he would take meaningful actions, changing tour schedules, arranging support, or stepping in when Joe was at risk of harming himself or the band. Joe said these moments were rarely talked about, and Don preferred it that way. But they meant more to Joe than Don ever knew. As Joe reflected on those years, he said the most painful part wasn't the arguments or the pressure. It was the realization of how much he misunderstood Don. Joe admitted that he spent years resenting Don's strict behavior, believing it was personal. Only later did he understand that Don was fighting his own internal battle, trying to maintain order in a band filled with strong personalities and conflicting lifestyles. Joe said that when he looks back now, he wishes he had communicated better, listened more, and recognized the emotional weight Don was carrying. Joe then confirmed something fans have long speculated: without Don Henley's discipline, the Eagles may never have achieved the monumental success they did. He said Don's perfectionism was the engine behind some of their greatest achievements. From recording sessions to live performances, Joe now believes that Don wasn't just demanding, he was essential. His vision, his structure, and his unbreakable focus held the band together during moments that could have easily destroyed them. Joe Walsh wasn't just revealing tension, he was revealing respect. His truth about Don Henley wasn't meant to expose flaws, but to finally give Don credit for the battles he fought in silence. As Joe Walsh continued revealing the truth about Don Henley, the conversation shifted toward the period that nearly destroyed the Eagles entirely. Joe said that the atmosphere inside the band became so tense during certain tours and recording sessions that he wasn't sure they would survive as a group. He explained that while the world saw their success, inside the studio the pressure was boiling. Don Henley, according to Joe, absorbed the stress more heavily than anyone else. He wasn't just dealing with music, he was dealing with label demands, scheduling conflicts, financial decisions, and the emotional volatility of every band member, including Joe himself. Joe admitted that he never fully understood how much Don was juggling, until years later. One of the toughest truths Joe confirmed was how Don often took the blame for decisions that weren't entirely his to make. He said that fans frequently assumed Don was being controlling or overbearing, but the reality was more complicated. Don was the one forced into making decisions when others couldn't agree, and he became the face of choices that were made collectively, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of urgency. Joe acknowledged that Don was often portrayed as the bad guy, simply because he was the one willing to take responsibility when no one else wanted to step forward. Joe said that with age, he has developed a deep respect for that courage, something he wishes he understood earlier. Joe then reflected on the moments during the band's near breakup when he and Don were barely able to communicate. The tension wasn't just creative, it was emotional. Joe described Don as someone who never allowed himself to fall apart, even when everything around him was crumbling. Joe said that Don was disciplined to a fault, holding himself to standards that were almost impossible to meet. But instead of showing his stress, he buried it, creating a pressure cooker inside himself that nobody recognized at the time. Joe admitted that he mistook Don's silence and seriousness for coldness, not realizing he was doing everything he could to hold the band together. One of the most heartbreaking truths Joe shared involved the years after the Eagles broke up. Joe said that during that long stretch of silence and distance, he often wondered if he and Don would ever reconcile. Joe recalled seeing interviews where Don appeared stoic, collected, and focused on his solo career. But underneath that exterior, Joe now believes Don was hurting far more than he let on. The breakup wasn't just a professional shift, it was a personal wound. Joe explained that although they rarely spoke during those years, he never stopped respecting Don's dedication to the music they created together. Joe also confirmed something fans suspected for decades. Despite their differences, Don Henley was one of the main reasons the Eagles eventually reunited. Joe said Don reached out in his own quiet, guarded way, never overly emotional, but sincere. When they finally talked again, Joe realized that Don never held grudges the way people assumed. He simply didn't know how to express emotion openly. Joe said that moment marked the beginning of a healing process between them, one that eventually allowed them to perform together again and even create new music. But perhaps the most powerful revelation Joe shared was about the personal transformation they both experienced with age. Joe said that as they grew older, their differences didn't disappear, but their understanding deepened. Don began to appreciate Joe's spontaneous creativity, and Joe finally understood Don's need for structure. Joe said that the older they got, the less their past conflicts mattered. What mattered was the bond created through decades of surviving fame, pressure, and personal chaos together. Joe made one thing clear: the truth about Don Henley isn't simple. He is demanding, serious, and sometimes difficult, but he is also loyal, protective, and far more emotionally complex than people ever realized. Joe said that despite everything, Don Henley remains one of the most important people in his life, a partner in music, a rival in the studio, and ultimately, a brother in ways that only the two of them will ever fully understand. Joe Walsh reflected on the long-term impact Don Henley had on both his life and the legacy of the Eagles. He explained that, despite the conflicts, the arguments, and the emotional distance, Don's influence was undeniable. Joe said that the band's legendary albums, timeless hits, and intricate harmonies were only possible because of Don's insistence on perfection. He admitted that, as a younger man, he often resented the pressure, believing it stifled his creativity. But now, looking back from the perspective of 77 years, Joe sees that Don's approach pushed him to reach a level of musicianship he might never have achieved otherwise. Joe also opened up about how their personal lives were intertwined with their professional struggles. He shared that Don's strict, disciplined personality often clashed with Joe's more free-spirited nature, leading to disagreements that sometimes felt personal. But he emphasized that Don's intentions were never malicious. Every criticism, every stern conversation, and every disagreement came from a place of wanting the best for the band and, ultimately, wanting the best for Joe as well. Joe said that this realization, though late, allowed him to finally let go of resentment that had lingered for decades. He went on to reveal the moments of silent support that often went unnoticed. During the band's toughest tours and recording sessions, Don would make subtle but significant gestures to keep things running smoothly. Whether it was stepping in to mediate disputes with other band members, organizing schedules, or quietly backing Joe when he struggled, Don's efforts were a lifeline. Joe described these acts as small, almost invisible, but essential, and said they demonstrated a side of Don Henley that very few people, even longtime fans, ever saw. These behind-the-scenes actions, Joe explained, helped the Eagles survive their internal turbulence and emerge stronger than ever. Joe also reflected on how fame amplified the tension between them. The media often portrayed Don Henley as controlling and Joe Walsh as the chaotic rebel. According to Joe, these simplified narratives ignored the reality that their differences complemented each other. In critical ways, the chaos pushed Don to maintain order, and Don's structure challenged Joe to refine his craft. While their relationship was far from easy, it created a dynamic that became the driving force behind some of the most iconic music of the 20th century. Joe admitted that he didn't fully understand or appreciate this dynamic until he had the distance of time and experience to see the bigger picture. Toward the end of the interview, Joe addressed the fans directly. He said that while the conflicts and disagreements have been part of their story, so is respect, admiration, and a shared commitment to music. He made it clear that he holds no grudges against Don and that, if anything, his feelings have evolved into a deep appreciation. Joe credited Don Henley for shaping not only the Eagles' music, but also his own growth as a musician and as a person. Without Don, Joe said, he wouldn't be the artist he is today, and the Eagles would not have left the indelible mark they did on rock history. Finally, Joe shared a personal reflection that resonated with many fans. He admitted that revealing this truth at 77 felt liberating. It was the first time he could honestly recount the highs and lows of his relationship with Don Henley without fear of judgment, without needing to protect the band's image, and without filtering his words for public consumption. He hoped that by sharing the story, fans could gain a more nuanced understanding of the band's history.